Welcome into a Wednesday edition of the RotoWire Fantasy Basketball Podcast. I am Nick Whalen, joined, as I will be, every Wednesday throughout the NBA season by my good friend, Brandon Kravitz. Brandon, we were just comparing weather here as I am in southeastern Wisconsin. You are down in Florida, and somehow it is the same temperature in Milwaukee as it is in the greater Orlando area today. So we've reached that time of the year, and I think that officially means that we're less than a week out from NBA season.
Absolutely. I've been wearing a long sleeve shirt for almost 24 straight hours now. It's a wonderful thing. I mean, it's a welcomed addition to the outside scope here in Florida because it's been humid, hot, and disgusting for as long as I can remember. So whenever you get that chill in the air, it is always a welcomed feeling.
It's good and bad. All right.
Well, for you, it's bad because once you feel it, you know things are about to go south quickly. For us, it's like
exactly.
It's going to be 80 degrees by next week.
It's going to be 41 degrees by the middle of next week here in Wisconsin. So those of us who enjoy the great game of golf, those days are coming to an end very quickly. So I'm going to get out a couple times this weekend, and I think that's going to be the final hurrah for the year. But we did not come here to talk weather. We did not come here to talk about my very pedestrian amateur golf game. We got a lot to get to on the show today. I want to run through some preseason notes. Preseason coming to an end soon. We've seen most teams now in action 3 or 4 times. A couple teams finishing out their slate as the week goes along. We're going to talk about an article that I put up on the site earlier this week detailing, if you want to have a safe draft or you want to have a somewhat safe draft and you want to know which players to target in each round, we'll talk about, some of our kind of safety valve players that we could always fall back on year in and year out. And we'll just kind of jump around, hit some other news items. I just saw a tweet, Brandon, indicating that James Harden is a no-show at Sixers practice today. I still feel like we're at square one. Well, what's the goal here at this point? If you're Harden, obviously it's still to force some sort of trade, but why show up in the first place? Practice, but not scrimmage. Be around the team, and now he's away from the team. I don't really know what levers he's exactly trying to pull here. There was some reporting, unsourced or at least anonymously sourced yesterday, that the Sixers are starting to canvass a little bit more aggressively as far as, what a James Harden trade might look like, getting some other teams beyond the Clippers involved. I still think the most likely scenario, given that we're 6 days away from opening night, is that Harden opens the season with the team. But I don't know if he's going to be out there on opening night. I still think he'll be a member of the Sixers, but do you expect him to play in their first game of the season?
I don't. So I've actually changed my tune on this the last couple of days. I don't think he's going to be on the team by the time the season starts.
Really?
I know that it's coming up soon. We're only a few days away from that. But this is a situation that, as James Harden has said himself, is not repairable. The Sixers have high expectations this year. They can't start the season with a headache like this. You're not going to get great value. That ship has sailed a long time ago. You just have to move off of James Harden, get what you can. They know that. And it seems like he's willing to play hardball in terms of not suiting up. It's said that he just wants to play basketball, but I think it was with a ... implied, not for you. So I don't think he's going to be on the team. He might be traded by the time we drop this episode.
It's possible. I think the fact that it's Daryl Morey on the other side of this, and he's like the one GM who I feel like has the best track record of not being pushed around in these scenarios, I have a hard time believing that he's just going to cave and take 60 cents on the dollar for James Harden. But, it's gotten to the point now where I think both sides would like this to be resolved before opening night. And that pressure is only going to turn up before we get to the middle of next week and the Sixers play their first game. Is there any other team that you could see emerging other than the LA Clippers? I don't know what team is lining up to get James Harden right now. I think there are some teams that are probably monitoring this and saying, okay, if we could see him play for a couple months and see that he's engaged and see that he still has it, maybe later on, depending on how our season's going, we would consider bringing a player like that in. You think of a team like the Heat or, I don't know, the Lakers, who are always open to bringing in any big name player. But I think those teams feel pretty good about where they're at right now. I wouldn't be aggressive in pushing the Clippers on that deal. I think if you're the Sixers and you say, let's just, for the sake of conversation, you want to trade him by opening night, I think my goal would be getting a third team involved, because I'm just not thrilled with what LA can offer here. I'm not the biggest Terrence Mann guy. I know they're calling him borderline untouchable. I get it. He's looked okay, when he's been given the opportunity, but if that's the headliner that I'm getting back for James Harden, I'm not psyched about it. It could be someone like Norman Powell, who's, a good 15 to 18 point per game guy off the bench. That's fine. But unless you get another team involved as the Sixers, I don't think you're going to get anything close to what peak James Harden gives you.
I think the most likely scenario is he gets dealt for, especially if it's the Clippers, an unprotected first-round pick, and then if you're Philadelphia, you cross your fingers and hope that the Clippers end up dealing with the injury bug, and that turns into a really valuable commodity. But I just don't think you're going to get a player of any substance in return at this point. I know it sounds crazy to say James Harden at his best is a really good player. There's not a big market for him. The season's about to start. All these rosters are locked in, and the Sixers want to get rid of him a whole lot more than these other teams seem to want to bring him in. I do think the Clippers make the most sense. I've thought that all along, far and away at the top of the list. There are a couple of others. I think Minnesota would be interesting to add another piece to their offense. If the Raptors wanted to try something different, I don't see them making a move like that. I know people keep throwing Miami out there. I think there's a less than 0% chance he ends up with the Miami Heat. Jimmy Butler has had a hard time getting along with teammates over the years because other players he's played with aren't completely locked in and committed to basketball. James Harden strikes me as the kind of guy that would drive him absolutely crazy.
So there's no question about that. I agree with you. I also part of me, just as a basketball fan, just out of pure curiosity, I kind of want to see him in Miami to see if that's the one organization that could get the most out of him, right? Like for the most part, they've avoided these I wouldn't say troubled players like that. That's not really fair to James Harden, but guys like Harden, they tend to avoid. But I think some of these same criticisms that we have about James Harden right now. Well, we could have said the same thing about Jimmy Butler when he was forcing his way out of Minnesota on national television. And, you go to Miami and you kind of get with that organization, you get with that coaching staff, and they have a way about, maximizing players, especially players like Harden, who we've kind of questioned, what kind of shape they're in to begin seasons. Like Miami doesn't deal with any of that, So I do think that there's a case to be made that if there's one team that could kind of get James Harden where he needs to be at this point in his career, it is the Heat. But I think Miami is content to kind of sit back, play this out, at least until, midseason trade deadline. And that's, when they would hopefully, another superstar shakes free and potentially make their move after striking out on Damian Lillard. I do want to ask you, if you think James Harden is being dealt in the next week or so, what does this mean for Tyrese Maxey? His composite ADP right now, we have a great page on rotowire.com. You can compare ADP from ESPN, CBS, Yahoo, Underdog, Fantrax, all the main sites. Maxey's at 60.2 right now. He went 56 overall in a 14-team Roto league that I did last night. If you think Harden's out the door and they're not bringing back another high usage star in that deal, which seems unlikely, does that mean that you're willing, to push Tyrese Maxey up, a half round or maybe even a full round?
Absolutely. I think a full round sounds like the right sort of move in terms of the way his value would increase with James Harden not on the floor. We thought last year was going to be that big breakout for Tyrese Maxey. He really just kind of steadied and stayed the same. He didn't have that big breakout season we were expecting. Without James Harden, I think that statistically you would get that. He's improving, or you at least think at his stage in the game that he should be taking that next step. It just seems like he hit a little bit of a plateau, but with James Harden not in the way, somebody's got to score other than Joel Embiid, so you would expect some really big nights for Maxey.
Yeah, I like Maxey a lot. Roto or points. I don't think there's a huge distinction there. Although in Roto leagues, 85% at the free throw line last year, that was actually his worst mark in 3 seasons. He's had some 87, 88% years at the line. For as small of a player as he is, to shoot 48% from the field in back-to-back years is huge. I mean, he was up over 43% from 3 last season, and just going into his age 23 year, I think a lot to like about Tyrese Maxey. I don't have him in enough leagues yet. I took Şengün over him, just kind of based on my build. I started Tyrese Halliburton, Desmond Bane, Pascal Siakam with my first 3 picks and wanted to get a big man there, but I certainly considered taking Tyrese Maxey in round 4 of that Roto draft last night. All right, I want to hit some kind of random preseason notes here, Brandon, then we'll get into some of the safest players to draft, hit a few other topics over the next 40 minutes or so. Your team, the Orlando Magic, was in action last night. They were taking on the New Orleans Pelicans. We saw kind of a weird game for the Pelicans over the weekend. They were playing the Rockets, and there were a few super cuts going around on Twitter of just woefully poor effort levels on the defensive end from the Pelicans, including Zion Williamson. But this was the Zion that we've been wanting to see last night. Played 16 minutes, went 6 of 8 from the field, 16 points, 3 rebounds, 3 assists, 5 steals, and 2 blocks. We have to put out the caveat every time we talk about Zion, the injuries. He's basically been a 30 to 50 game player. Are you willing to take that risk this time around? Has he shown you enough?
Just being there in the building last night, being able to see him in person for the first time, the Zion appearance has always eluded me because he's either been hurt or there was COVID and I couldn't go to the building. There was always something going on. All restraints are off for me. I'm blown away. I mean, this is the Zion that I had hoped to see when witnessing it in person. It was the best version of him playing basketball. Plays above the rim, played hard on defense, got his teammates involved. He knows his space on the floor. If he's going to play like that, I mean, look, he only played 29 games last year. That's been well documented. But look at the numbers he put up when he was on the floor. 26 points per game, 7 rebounds, 5 assists. Now he's going to add the defensive side into his repertoire. We know he's capable of it, but was he a willing defender? And that body, seems like he has been working out a bit. He looked more put together than pudgy, which we have seen from Zion. Absolutely blown away. Perhaps still a little high off of what I witnessed last night, but yeah I'm totally in on Zion.
I want to be in. I really do. I will take him. I've decided at or around ADP. He went in the early 40s. I think he went 41 overall in the 8-team Roto League that we drafted last night. And I'm still not willing to go there. I'm not jumping ADP for Zion. We've learned our lesson on that one too many times. But last year, he was a total cross off for me. I wouldn't have taken him anywhere inside probably the top 65 or 70. This year, if it gets to the end of round 4, if we're talking Şengün versus Zion or Tyrese Maxey versus Zion, that is more of a debate to me. I think you just have to be realistic about what the expectations are. If you're big on Zion, and you're taking him, early in round 3, which you'll see every now and then, I think you have to expect 50 to 55 games. Anything you get beyond that is a bonus. That's great. But you cannot really plan your team, especially in a Roto League where you're so worried about specific categories and kind of trying to balance risk reward early in the draft. I'm not willing to go as far as to say, all right, I think he can play 65 games. 50 to me is a win if he gets there.
So I think it really depends on your own confidence of your ability to find players that you think could be suitable replacements later in the draft. If you think that you have those players targeted, then take your shots at the point where Zion is going off the board. I think you make a really good point. Do you want to jump ADP super aggressively with Zion? You're more likely to get burned than have that pay off. But if you get him at cost, there are some of those guys, we might even end up talking about him, the safer players. I'm drafting him. I'm looking right now at RotoWire.com, being drafted right around the same spot as Nick Vucevic. I'm taking Zion every day of the week because we know what Vuce is. He'll give you that nice, steady performance, 17 and 11 pretty much every single night. But Zion's got that league-winning upside. I'm just willing to take that shot at cost, I think, without a doubt. I am because when he plays, he is just a complete difference maker, and his style is so conducive to just simply putting up these gaudy stats. I want to be on the right side of that.
Yeah, I would go as far as to say that he is him when he plays, Brandon.
He really is. I mean, he's
people much younger than me say.
Yeah. It's 100% true. I thought he was, for both teams, he was the best player that I saw on the floor last night, without a doubt. And Franz played really well, by the way.
Yeah, well, let's talk about the Magic side of this. I can assure you that this will be the most Magic slanted basketball podcast that anybody listens to throughout the season. I mean, I
apologize in advance for that.
Oh, hey, that's a good thing. The Magic are a fun team this year. You are as boots on the ground as it gets with the Orlando Magic, and it was not a great night for Paolo Banchero. For the most part, I think he's looked really good in the preseason, but 2 of 9 last night for 5 points in just 20 minutes. You mentioned Franz; he looked fantastic. He got a mention in the Safest Players article. 19 points for him on 8 of 11 in just 19 minutes. Anything else to point out, either from this game last night against New Orleans, or just some general preseason long trends that you've noticed with Orlando?
Yeah, I mean, just as a team in general, this isn't one single player specific, but it could help bolster some of the fantasy value for these guys, is that they've put a lot of emphasis into shooting more corner threes. I tracked it during the first half last night. They attempted 9 threes from the corner. They made 6 of them. this is a team that really struggled with their 3-point shooting percentage. And it wasn't just one guy, Jalen Suggs, Gary Harris, Wendell Carter Jr., Franz Wagner, all these guys. It was clearly a mission from Jamal Mosley to for spacing purposes and to have everybody feel comfortable in that spot because it's the most high percentage three that's out there. So it's a clear point of emphasis for this team. If it's something that works throughout I don't expect them to shoot at that rate over 50% over the course of the season from deep. It's a little unrealistic, but they were the 25th worst team in the NBA in terms of 3-point shooting. Right. So hopefully you see that improve just based on the game plan. Anthony Black and Jet Howard, I think you can take off your board completely. I think that might be my biggest fantasy takeaway from last night. Those guys didn't play until the second half. This was a full dress rehearsal for the Magic and for the Pelicans. So last night was a good indication of what this team is, what the rotations are going to look like. And those two guys, I know they were drafted inside of the top 11. And for Anthony Black, drafted inside of the top 10, he was the 6th overall pick. These guys are going to be non-factors early on in the season.
Where do you come in on the Magic win total? 37.5 is the number at FanDuel. You'll see some 36.5s out there at some other books. This was a 34-win team a year ago. James Anderson and I, did our annual win totals pod for the East earlier this week. I hate to say it, Brandon, we both went under on the Magic. I like where this team is headed overall, but part of the reason is what you just mentioned. Like they had 2 lottery picks. I don't think either of those guys are going to be real impact players this season. Their other huge offseason addition was bringing in Joe Ingles, who to me looked completely washed as a member of the Bucks last season. So I think there's going to be internal improvement with guys like Banchero and Wagner, but I always worry about how many games Wendell Carter is going to play, and the shooting to me remains a big concern, right? Like if you're starting Fultz and Suggs, and Banchero, I think he'll shoot it better this year, but went through some big time struggles. I think he hit like 1-3 in the month of February last season. Like I do worry about the overall shooting on this team. You could be starting like 2 of the worst shooting guards in the NBA together.
I think the other side of that, though, is that Fultz and especially Jalen Suggs are really good defensive players, so they should be able to slow down opposing guards a little bit better than most teams around the NBA. So maybe they can mitigate some of that. And on the nights where they are shooting well, they're going to have quite the advantage because of that. Franz is going to be steady. Paolo's Paolo. So, I mean, I don't need to sell you on that. The reason why I would take the over, and I know that shocks you, I'm the Magic guy. I'm taking the over for the win total. Last year they started 5-20. They were just brutalized by injury. They were an above 500 team from the 26th game on for the remainder of the season. I think that's a better indication of what they are. A team that's like 42 and 40 or 40 and 42. Like that to me is what the Magic are right now. And when you consider some of those players that the Cole Anthony, Markelle Fultz, Jalen Suggs, that glut at guard, these are all guys that are in contract years. So you're about to get one hell of an effort from all of them. We know players always play their best when they're playing for the dollar. So I think the Magic are good for close to 40 wins.
We will see. We'll go head to head on that one. I still like the under, especially if you're getting it at 37.5. I think this is a team to me that will be in the play-in conversation. I don't know that I see them pushing for a 6-7 seed. To me, they're closer to the bottom end of that, but very interested to see how that plays out. We got to talk about somebody that I did not think we would mention at any point through the first few weeks of this pod, Brandon. Julian Strawther out in Denver, continuing to play well in the preseason. Had 12 points last night against the Clippers. That was actually his worst game by far of the exhibition slate. Went 3 of 11 from the field, 2 of 7 from 3. But prior to that, he had 3 straight games where he'd hit 4 3-pointers. Just coming in with a ton of confidence. Somebody that they traded back into the first round to get at pick 29 out of Gonzaga. I'm a little bit hesitant as far as what his role will be right away. This is a team that still has KCP. They got Christian Brown, who they're expecting to take a big leap this season. I mean, Justin Holiday, who's kind of been this like random plug and play guy. And I think it's kind of a trustworthy veteran on both ends of the floor. I think he'll play as well. And, Reggie Jackson's in the mix at guard. So I don't know that Strawther is going to be walking into like 20 minutes a night right away. But I think this is someone that at this point we do need to be keeping an eye on. And, if you're looking for just one of those like Hail Mary picks in the last 2 rounds of a draft, like he's somebody that I'm willing to entertain now in that conversation.
Yeah, it's fun to slam the button on a guy that's been outstanding in the preseason. I think this is more preseason fool's gold than anything else.
Yeah.
But he was outstanding at Gonzaga, seems to have rolled right over into this opportunity with Denver. I just don't see where the minutes really are. So this is a name that when he does pop up at random due to injury, we'll go, hey, remember when he had that great preseason? But other than that, I think you might draft him and you'll feel good about it, hitting that button late in drafts, and then he'll be on the waiver wire sooner than later.
Yeah, I'm hoping this is not like a Josh Selby Summer League conversation. Somebody that we're bringing up 10 years later and being like, oh yeah, he was Summer League MVP. That was a fun time. All right, real quickly, I want to ask you about Kristaps Porzingis, who has looked amazing through the preseason. I mean, I think one of the concerns with Porzingis fantasy-wise was, all right, he was kind of like the option 1A, 1B over the second half of last season once Bradley Beal was out of the lineup in Washington. Now he goes to potentially being the third or even fourth option on a lot of nights for the Celtics, but he's been a seamless fit. I think in a very limited preseason sample, he looks to be like somebody who's benefiting from playing with better players around him. I mean, just some of the looks that he's getting, some of the wide open threes. He's 4 of 8 from downtown last night in a win over the Knicks, 20 points, 8 boards, 2 blocks in 28 minutes. I remain skeptical. He's exactly the type of player that I typically avoid. I always tend to be a safer drafter, whether we're talking fantasy football or fantasy basketball. I don't like taking guys who have a track record of playing like 43 games a year. Where are you at on Porzingis? Has he kind of convinced you to take that leap at all?
I'm pretty much the same way. If I don't get one of those elite bigs at the top, I usually end up more safe in terms of filling out that roster spot. But he does intrigue me because of his unicorn ability that we've been privy to throughout the course of his career. 50% from 3 last night. This is a guy that can knock it down if you do leave him open. And the Celtics are going to score enough points where if you're the third option, you can still have decent numbers. I would say buyer beware a little bit of just judging based on what you saw last night, even though, it's not like an oddity stat line, but he only played 28 minutes. He'll give you more than that in the regular season. When he plays the Knicks, he's going to blow up. So that's my point. He's going to have his best outings will be against his former team. I can almost guarantee that. I like Porzingis. Don't love him. Not willing to reach on him.
Yeah, I hope he stays healthy. I mean, it's significantly more fun when guys like him are involved. You could say the same thing about Zion Williamson. Like, I am a Bucks fan. I would prefer that the Bucks are the team that emerges from the East, and I think the Celtics are, the primary team that's going to stand in their way. But I don't want to go into the Eastern Conference Finals with Kristaps Porzingis out with a knee injury. I think it's more fun if all of these guys are at full strength, but still not ready to draft a guy like that in the 30s in a fantasy draft. Let's talk a little Toronto Raptors, Brandon. They get a 106-102 win in the preseason last night over the Chicago Bulls. This one, felt like a pretty real dress rehearsal, I think, for both sides, right? We saw, most players play into the late 20s. A lot of the key guys on both teams in terms of minutes. We saw, I think, a relatively realistic spread of what the minutes could look like off the bench for both sides. I'm curious to get your take on, like, what is the general direction for the Toronto Raptors this season? Like, they to me were one of the most difficult win totals to pick. And you're getting a low number as far as the Raptors go. I think it was like 37.5, now down to 35.5.
Wow.
At the DraftKings Sportsbook. It was 37.5 on Monday when we recorded that pod. So it's already on the decline. I think there is this underlying belief that, okay, Toronto's going to feel it out. They're going to see what their team is, but this could finally be the year where, they look to hit some sort of, I don't think it'll be a full reset. I don't think they're the type of team that wants to go into a season and win like 18 games. But they have a smart, forward-thinking front office, a front office that we trust to make the right decisions. What do you think this team looks like early on? And is there a chance, I should say, that Pascal Siakam, OG Anunoby, guys like that could be on the move if they want to eventually reset this thing around Scotty Barnes?
I don't think they're the type of organization to bottom out. So that's where I'm skeptical on that number, but clearly that's been hit by some smart money for it to drop by a couple of wins. Take that into account. But based on my perception of the Toronto Raptors, they're the Heat of the North. They don't do it quite as well, but they do have a championship in the last several years to their name because of their ability to get aggressive when when they know it can put them over the top. So getting Kawhi Leonard, I think
Mm-hmm.
it definitely had a lot of us in the basketball community taking them more seriously as a franchise that's willing to put the pedal to the metal when they see they have a roster that can win. I'm not sure this is that roster, but I don't trust them to bottom out. So I think they're going to hold a number of these pieces so that they can at least maintain some level of stability. Do they move off of a Gary Trent Jr. who they brought back? Do they move off of OG Anunoby, whose name has lived on the trade block? Even Pascal Siakam, if they wanted to swing for the fences and bring in someone else to just shake things up. All of those things are possibilities, but I felt like last year was the year if they were going to make moves to blow up this roster. The fact that that didn't happen makes me think they're just going to stay the course and they just cross their fingers and hope that one of these guys like Scotty Barnes turns into a full-blown superstar.
Yeah, Scotty Barnes looked great last night. 22, 6 rebounds, 3 assists, 2 steals, 4 blocks. I've not got as much Scotty Barnes as I would like this year. I went hard on Scotty Barnes last year, Brandon, and that worked out to varying degrees. But it was not quite the second-year leap we were expecting. But I think the best case scenario for Barnes is they do, hit a hard reset midseason, right? And I think Siakam to me is the obvious one. OG Anunoby, I think they value him, and rightfully so. They value him maybe more than a lot of other teams do. Like you said, he's been in every trade conversation for the last 2 years, and they never pull the trigger because I think they really place a high value on what he could be. Siakam, love the player. He's one of the safest guys to draft in fantasy every year. Because plays a ton of minutes, and we'll see what that looks like post Nick Nurse, because that was something that always gave the Toronto Raptors like a 5% boost, because you just knew those starters were going to play like 36 to 38 minutes every night, when a lot of teams aren't doing that anymore. But Siakam is an expiring contract. He's kind of gunning for a potential supermax eligibility, and this will be his age 30 season, right? And Toronto to me is not the type of franchise that is going to want to pay a max or certainly not a supermax to a player of where Siakam is at in his career right now.
Yeah, I agree. But if he does, if he maintains that level of all NBA sort of status, then why not? So if they're looking for what is the core moving forward, it's hard to move off of a guy like that. I think unless you have and you also have to keep in mind this upcoming draft is not supposed to be what this past one was. There's no Wembanyama coming out. So if you're going to bottom out, what are you doing it for? It's another thing to keep in mind when projecting forward.
So you're right about the draft, but I also feel like we say this like every other year. There's not a Wembanyama prize, no question about that. And as of right now, there's not even a Scoot Henderson level prospect I think available. But I feel like historically, every time that we've said it's a bad draft, there's always somebody, right? Somebody emerges, whether it's, now you got all these different channels, whether it's the G League Ignite, whether it's overtime, whether it's a college player. I think Brandon Miller was on the radar coming into the college season. I don't think, going into November of last year, anybody would have said that Brandon Miller was going to go number 2 overall in the draft. So I'm of the belief that drafts, that we think are going to be bad, always, you talk yourself into players. It's the same thing in the NFL when you say, oh, it's a bad quarterback draft. And what happens every time? You got 3 quarterbacks that go in the top 5 picks because of need and because teams talk themselves into these players. The other thing to keep an eye on with Toronto, Brandon, is they owe their 2024 first-round pick to San Antonio. And it is protected 1 through 6. So what they don't want to be is like the 7th worst team, and you're handing over the number 7 pick to San Antonio. So you either need to be confidently, in that like middle zone in the East where you're pushing for a playoff spot or a play-in spot, and you're okay maybe forking over like the 15th overall pick. But the other side of that is if you do decide to rebuild this thing and you do sell off pieces, you don't like how you start the season, you got to make sure you're in the bottom 6, because the whole point of that is not to be giving up a lottery pick to San Antonio. So they have some interesting things to keep in mind in terms of that 2024 pick.
Yeah, there'll be a fun team to keep an eye on early on in the season, because if they end up outproducing what we expect from them, then they probably don't do anything. This is not an organization that wants to make big moves, but they'll make them if they have to. I just haven't really seen them bottom out in a long time, so it's hard for me to believe that they're going to do that. But please remind me throughout the course of the season that when the Raptors play the Bulls, to just take the underdog. Whoever's catching points, take that team, because these teams are evenly matched.
Yeah, man. We'll talk about the Bulls on another episode. That's just that's a franchise that to me is just they are dead set on winning exactly 38 games with the roster they have.
This is the Spider-Man meme. These two teams are the same.
But at least one of them has Scotty Barnes, right? It's like the Bulls don't have that young asset that conceivably you could talk yourself into building around, and even Anunoby and Siakam, it's like I think those guys probably have more trade value, certainly than Vucevic does at this point, and DeRozan's expiring. I don't know. I don't want to go down the Bulls rabbit hole. This is dangerous territory. We'll save that for another week.
Fair.
Before we talk about the safest players to target in each round, we got a couple messages to pass along from our wonderful sponsors. First, Underdog Fantasy. Underdog is the #1 platform for best ball leagues, and that includes fantasy basketball. It's not just football over at Underdog. Underdog's featured best ball tournament for the upcoming season has $500,000 in total prizes. If you have not tried Underdog yet, new users at Underdog receive a first-time deposit bonus up to $100. Plus, you get a free 6-month subscription to RotoWire that takes you through, obviously, all of draft season, most of the NBA season. All you got to do to get that subscription and to get that deposit bonus is use the promo code RWNFL. That's RWNFL. Go to UnderdogFantasy.com, or you can download the Underdog app. It's one of the best fantasy apps out there. Really friendly user interface. Go download that app or go to UnderdogFantasy.com. And again, be sure to use our promo code RWNFL. That will get you the deposit bonus up to $100, as well as the free 6-month subscription to RotoWire. And that's all sports. If you're prepping for your fantasy baseball draft, it's not like you just get NBA content. You get everything that we offer over at RotoWire. We're also welcoming a new sponsor to the pod this week. That is Vivid Seats. The NBA season is almost here. And on behalf of our friends at Vivid Seats, let's get one thing clear. Nothing, Brandon, beats seeing your favorite team crush it on the court to the sound of thousands of screaming fans. Every dunk, every dribble, and every heart-pounding play from your favorite team live and in person. And because Vivid Seats is the only ticketing company where you can earn rewards on every purchase, you can score amazing deals and unrivaled annual awards all season long. Plus, with a 100% buyer guarantee, you can be sure your ticket will be as legit as your love for the game. Visit vividseats.com or download the app today and use our promo code ROTOWIRE, ROTOWIRE. That'll get you $20 off your first ticket purchase of at least $200. Again, that promo code is ROTOWIRE for $20 off your first $200 ticket purchase. Download the app or visit vividseats.com. Vivid Seats. Experience it live. All right, Brandon, I mentioned at the top, put up a piece that you can find at rotowire.com. It also went up on Yahoo Fantasy Basketball, so check it out on one of those two platforms. The safest players to target in each round. And obviously, when you're talking safe players in any sort of fantasy game, the #1 thing that comes to mind is games played, right? And that is at the forefront more than it's ever been in fantasy basketball. These last 2 seasons, especially, I think have been extremely frustrating. I've had a couple of leagues that have converted from weekly lineups to daily lineups just because of how much variance there's been in terms of games missed. I know the NBA, they continue to implement small changes to try to spur players into playing more. I'm not of the belief that we're going to see a massive turnaround. I think maybe over the long term that might be a trend that the NBA can kind of work on. But I don't think year over year, all these guys that played 60 to 65 games are suddenly going to be playing 77, 78 games. So this is something we're going to be dealing with year in and year out. The important thing for me when I go into a draft, especially early on, you want to find that risk reward balance. You don't want to take all safe players, but if you're drafting Kyrie Irving in the second, or you're taking Zion Williamson, like you want to balance that out and make sure that if things go awry with a guy like that, that you have some safety to fall back on. So I went through, I broke down the safest player to target in each round, talked about some of the honorable mentions, other safe players. And in round 1, it was pretty obvious. I almost felt bad, writing this one up because everybody's like, duh. But Nikola Jokic, part of what makes him so unique in fantasy is not only does he have the highest upside of any player in the NBA, I think you could argue that he's also the safest of all the superstars.
Yeah, I don't know how much we need to sell people on Nikola Jokic, but I completely agree. I mean, he is the 101 for me without a doubt. I actually just did 2 underdog drafts just a couple of days ago, and they place you randomly in their best ball drafts in terms of your draft position. That's not like you have to like race your friends or anything like that for the season long leagues. I wound up with the #1 pick in both, and I did not overthink it. I just took Jokic in both drafts. Let's just load up on that. I'm fine having Jokic shares this year.
Yeah, and that's about exactly what I put in the piece was, look, if you're at 1-1, don't overthink it. Take Nikola Jokic. There's been really no reason to believe that that's not the safest investment you can make. And, look, at some point he's probably going to get hurt, but he's been wildly durable. I think there's something to be said about, he's been criticized for his physique, but I also think there's just something about like the lack of strain I think that he puts on his body, especially during the offseason. Like in a roundabout way, I think that actually helps him in the NBA. He's not somebody that's ever, put a ton of time into his body. And for the most part, it's worked out for him. So I'm not going to tell him to adjust that. He's averaging 74.5 games per season since coming into the league, which is, extremely high, especially when you compare it to a lot of the guys that go in round one. So not a whole lot to say there. I mentioned Jayson Tatum as my honorable mention. The great thing about Tatum is you can often get him, 5, 6, 7, sometimes, even later in the first round. And there are certainly players with more upside. Like I don't think in a best case scenario, Jayson Tatum has like number one overall player upside, but his ADP right now is 5.4. If you take him at 5, like worst case scenario, it feels like he's going to return like late first round value.
Yeah, he's a guy exactly what you're going to get. He's been steady over the years, and I think he still has an MVP level season in him. We talked about that on one of our prior episodes. I actually think he's a good value at MVP, and if he's able to pull off something like that or anything even close to it, then he's going to return that value and then some. So yeah, when I get to that range where the guys that should go ahead, the obvious Jokic, Doncic, Embiid, Giannis, I'm taking SGA over Tatum, but I think right after that, I would take Jayson Tatum over Tyrese Halliburton. I don't know where you end up landing on that.
Yeah, I think I would have done the same thing last night in our Roto League. I actually ended up taking Halliburton at 4 over SGA. Tatum went 3 in that draft. I believe it was an auto draft situation. So I would have been happy to land Tatum. Like that's exactly the type of draft that I tend to lean on, especially in a Roto League. Like I love Luka, but the free throw percentage for how many he takes and how little improvement there's been, like that really is kind of a killer. And Tatum is just so well rounded across the board. I don't really worry about the arrival of Porzingis and Holiday impacting him too much. If anything, you worry about maybe Jaylen Brown taking a slight step back in terms of usage. But I think Tatum is pretty solidly installed as their number one option. In round 2, and we won't just narrate my entire article. I will say that, but these early round picks are fun to talk about. Trae Young is who I settled on for my safest pick in round 2, and I think there is a disconnect between how we think about Trae Young in real life and how we should think about him in fantasy. I mean, he's been a top 15 player in 4 straight years. He's got a pair of top 5 finishes in that span. For a player who's as small and slight as he is, I mean, he's been remarkably durable.
Yeah, 73 and 76 games the last 2 seasons. I loved this. I love the fact that you teed this up in your article because you're 100% right. We view Trae Young as a guy who go, okay, well, I mean, regular season success. The guy can't get it done in the playoffs. You get that one blip of the Eastern Conference Finals appearance, but and then there is that perception that he gets hurt all the time. But the last 2 years, that has not been the case. And I like the fact that Quinn Snyder has upped the pace. They're up about 15 spots in the NBA in terms of just overall pace from their days of Nate McMillan being the head coach. So more pace means more possessions, more chances to score. The ball does tend to stop with Trae, but I think Quinn Snyder is starting to speed him up a little bit. And if he's knocking down threes, you're going to be very happy having him on your roster.
Well, and if the ball stops with him, that's great for fantasy. that might not be great for the Hawks, but that's exactly what we want. I want the ball to stop in Trae Young's hands. You mentioned the 3-pointers. That's something to monitor because it's kind of been every other year for him. Like first year in the NBA, he struggled early on, was about 2 threes per game. Second year when he really broke out, almost averaged 30, 3.4 made threes per game. The year after that, he's down to 2.2. Then he was back up to 3.1. And then last year was back down to 2.1. I think we think of Trae Young as like this junior version of Stephen Curry, but in terms of volume, that has really not been the case.
Yeah, he has moments where he steps into the Oklahoma version of himself, but he really does. He gets to the rack really well, and he utilizes that part of his game. Mid-range is there, and I would like him to shoot more threes because he's quite good at it.
Yeah, no question about that. Percentage-wise, he's kind of gone every other year as well. I mean, he was 38.2% in 2021-22, down to 33.5% last season. So I guess history suggests that this is the year that he bounces back and it keeps that trend going and gets you over three-pointers per game, which obviously is huge for fantasy. Round 3 to me is really interesting. There's a lot of safety in round 3. Like that's actually one of my favorite rounds to draft because I feel like there's not really a player who typically goes in round 3 where I would say, I didn't really feel good about that pick. It's like you got like LeBron is falling to round 3 in a lot of drafts. I'm for the most part skeptical just because of the games played with him. But like DeJounte Murray, Trae Young's teammate in Atlanta, he's been remarkably durable as well, as huge upside in terms of steals. Pascal Siakam is the player I ended up settling on. We've already talked about him, so we don't have to go into a ton of depth. But Bam Adebayo was another player that I highlighted as well. I think with Bam, like there's still like a little bit of lingering disappointment for me because I think it was coming out of the bubble season. We're thinking like, man, this guy could be like an end of the first round type of player if he continues to develop. And he's gotten better at the things that he's already good at, but the fact that he has not been able to expand his shooting range to me is a disappointment. And obviously Miami's been just fine without that. The shot blocking is kind of come and gone a little bit. But in roto leagues, the fact that he was an 80+% free throw shooter for a guy who was hovering around the mid 70s earlier in his career, like that to me is been the biggest boost to his fantasy profile. Not a player who has, I wouldn't even say, top 20, top 15 upside, but if you're taking him at around his ADP of like 32, 33, I don't see a world in which you're disappointed.
Well, and that's what this is all about. Your article is about safety and delivering on expectations. Sometimes you want to draft players that are going to deliver the output of where you drafted them exactly. And he's been able to do that. You pointed out in the article, he ranked 32nd, 34th, 21st, and 31st, respectively, over the last 4 seasons. So this is a guy that wherever you take him, in that range, he'll give you that if he stays on the floor, and he's proven that he can do that as well.
Yeah, so in round 4, talked about Jaylen Brown, another guy he's had some minor injury issues, but for the most part, I feel like is pretty safe. Going to give you 3rd, maybe early 4th round value, depending on how many games he plays. We already touched on Vucevic. I mean, he's been as safe as it gets. He's played 70 games in 5 of the last 7 seasons, played all 82 last year, but he is 33, and you do feel like at some point, maybe there could be a fall off coming. Talked about Julius Randle in round 5, another guy who I think his fantasy profile doesn't necessarily match up with how he's valued in real life. Once you get into round 6, round 7, that's where we start to get variance. Like there's not really such thing as like a rock solid safe option when you're talking about picking in the late 60s. And that's kind of why I settled on Franz Wagner. And it's tough when you're talking about a player who's only been in the league for 2 years. But I love what I've seen from Franz Wagner. I love what I've seen from him in the preseason. He's barely missed any time. I think he's missed 5 total games over his first 2 seasons. But you are more qualified to talk about Franz Wagner than me. So is there another leap coming for him in year 3?
I think that he can take a step up. A leap I don't see because he's already playing like he's a 5-year vet. I don't think you can look at this guy like, he's entering into year 3, so waiting for that breakout. I think he already is who he is, but who he is a really good, safe, and steady player. He's an Iron Man. He plays through ankle injuries all the time. It's not that he doesn't get hurt. It's that he's one of the rare players in the NBA that actually plays through his injuries. Yes, I know. It sounds crazy. And he's hot right now, too, coming off of – the guy's just played so much basketball recently. He played Eurobasket last year. FIBA this year. He's played almost all of his NBA games that he's been available for. In this preseason, he's shooting 75% from the field. So I'm that all of those things, he's going to be the most steady producer on the Magic night in and night out. Even more so than Paolo will give you the splash games. Franz is going to give you the same stat line every single night.
Yeah, I feel like he's going to take the torch from Chris Middleton and Tobias Harris as just those perfect safety valves that you can always get a round later than you should be going in fantasy drafts.
Yeah, because people don't get excited about him, but this is all about, like you said, this is about balancing your roster. You're never going to win by going risk every single round. You're never going to win going safe every single round. So can you balance those two things? And Franz is the perfect balance to, hey, if you took Zion the round before, go ahead and take Franz in that range.
All right, I want to hit on a couple more players, and then we'll talk about some late round values and get out of here for the day. Rudy Gobert. Rudy Gobert was a major thorn in my side last year. I think he is the sole reason that I ended up being a buyer in the RotoWire Stake League. I spent way too much on him. That was an auction format. And somehow I got him again in that league. I did not want to. Believe me, that was not the goal. But he went for $13 cheaper than last season. Basically, it was a situation where I couldn't let Ken Kreitz get him for like $15, so I ended up, trying to bid him up a little bit. Got stuck with him, but I think I got him for like 16 or 17 in a $200 budget, which I was okay with. His ADP in draft leagues is 64.4 right now. That's right about where he finished last year. Am I wrong to think that last year was the baseline? And if he does that again and you take him in the 60s, so be it. You'll live with it. It's a lot different than taking him like 25th like you were last year. Is there a bounce back here, or are you of the belief that Rudy Gobert's best days are behind him?
It is crazy when you look back and think of how excited we were that he was with the Minnesota Timberwolves, and just how I mean, that ADP last year, absolutely ridiculous.
I was so in on that team. I actually went and looked back. We did a like preseason, fictional $1,000 futures bets, and like myself and James Anderson were like just pounding Timberwolves bets left and right.
Yeah, that feels like last year is what he is. Fifth overall in the NBA in terms of rebounds, scores about 13 points per game, which isn't that different from what he was doing in Utah. He's giving you the blocks. I mean, that dropped off a little bit last season. I would expect that to bounce back. He's an excellent defensive player. You've mentioned free throw percentage a number of times on the pod today. You're not getting that from Mr. Gobert. So you kind of have to just stomach that sort of thing. That's par for the course for most bigs in the NBA. But yeah, I think last year I think baseline is a good way to put it. I feel like that is who he is. You're not going to get a better version of him, but I can't imagine that he is continuing to slide in the other direction. I think we may have just overvalued him, and more than anybody, Minnesota did.
I mean, he's only 31, right? I think if he was 33, 34, I would not be rostering him in any league. But I'm of the belief that there could be a minor bounce back. Like, I'm not saying he's going to come back and be like 2.5 blocks, 14 rebounds a game. Like those days are probably gone. And Karl-Anthony Towns is also probably playing more than 29 games this year, which I don't think really hurts Gobert all that much, but it certainly doesn't help him the more that Towns is in the lineup. We didn't see much of a change in terms of his production with or without Towns last year. You mentioned the free throw percentage. That's always an issue. I guess at least he's taking like 2 fewer free throws per game. So it's maybe not as damaging as it was in years past, but 64, 65%, that's something that you're going to have to work to either lean into and punt or try to offset in a roto league. But you just need him to like the points and rebounds. I'm not that concerned about. Like if he just gives you 13 points and 12 boards again, that's fine. But it's got to be the blocks. Like he cannot.
Yeah, the blocks have to be there. I mean, that was his worst season since his rookie year.
He had half as many blocks last year as he did, with Utah 2 years ago. Like that just can't happen. Like even if he just gets to like 1.9 or 2.0 blocks per game, you can live with that, and I think he'll be a decent value. But I'm wading into those waters pretty trepidatiously. But I do think if for a guy with this track record, he's also been wildly healthy as far as like 7'2" big men go. Not many guys his size play as many games as he has, over the last decade. So I do think there's a little bit more safety there with Gobert than you would think. Everybody feels like they're just completely out on him. I want to ask you about Buddy Hield as well. His ADP sitting in the low 80s. I mentioned him as one of my favorite safe players to target in round 7. Since Buddy Hield entered the league in 2016, he is number 1 in total games played by 23. Nobody else is even all that close. He's number 2 in total made three-pointers with 1,705. He ranks behind only Stephen Curry in that category. He's finished second in the NBA in total made threes in 4 consecutive seasons. I actually like him. I think you can get him at like 30-1 to lead the NBA in made threes this year, which is essentially just a hedge against Steph Curry. If Curry goes down and plays like 50 games, I think Buddy Hield might be the guy that could step in and finally get that title. But what worries me is the trade potential here. And he's one of those guys who's kind of been like half on the trade block for a couple of years. But after extension talks stalled with the Pacers this offseason, like that seems more realistic than ever. I think as of right now, based on what we've seen in the preseason, there's a pretty good chance he comes off the bench behind Ben Mathurin. I don't know that it really kills him. I still think he plays a ton of minutes, but it's not a good thing. The question is, if he's moved, is that something that could negatively impact his value relative to the role that he's held in Indiana for the last couple of years?
Yeah, well, you mentioned that Mathurin was still able to put up numbers coming off the bench. So clearly that six-man role with Indiana is still able. I wouldn't let that scare you off too much. I think he's being underdrafted based on what he's able to do from three-point range. I don't worry too much about where he ends up because if a team is trading for Buddy Hield at any stage in the season, they're doing that because they want that tool in their tool belt of what he brings in terms of three-point shooting. You're not just adding him so that so that you can put him on the bench as a new shiny toy that you don't use. So Buddy Hield should be involved wherever he goes. Now, in terms of the best case scenario, I don't want him to get traded if I've got Buddy Hield because I love the way the Indiana Pacers play basketball. Very fantasy friendly. And so I would like him to stay. And if you have him, that should be what you're cheering for here. But I wouldn't be overly concerned with where he ends up because it's going to be a team that needs what he brings to the table. And they're going to use him a lot, whoever it is.
All right, let's finish out with talking some late round values. If we're talking like round 10 and later, you're just looking for some upside. Oftentimes I'm actually targeting like some degree of safety with those picks. It's kind of a time to look at your roster, especially if you're in a league that differentiates between like point guard, shooting guard, small forward, power forward. Kind of make sure you have some depth. Like I went into a league last year where I kind of was not really paying attention, like doing the draft on my phone, and realized that I had like one small forward eligible player on my roster. And, if that player goes down, obviously you're going to be in a bind. So, it's kind of a combination for me where let's say, your last four picks of a draft, like two of those, I'm targeting high upside guys, guys who I could be dropping 3 weeks into the season, but guys who have conceivable upside. And then I want to just kind of build depth, almost like a real NBA roster at some positions that I'm not quite as strong at. One of those guys for me every year, Ivica Zubac. Nobody's excited to draft Zubac. He's going on average about pick 128 in drafts this season. But you talk about a guy who plays 70-plus games every year. He's been 72 or above in each of the last four seasons, and two of those were 72-game seasons. Keep that in mind as well. So he didn't miss any time in 1920 or 2021. Kind of just a points, rebounds, and a couple blocks type of guy. I shouldn't even say a couple. 1.0 block for him is fine. Field goal percentage is big. And, he's certainly not a plus at the free throw line, but he's got an 80% season under his belt. He's about a 71% career free throw shooter, but I do have some optimism that he could bounce back in that regard. So he's, again, not going to be a plus in the free throw percentage category in roto leagues, but to me, he's also not somebody that's in like the Andre Drummond zone.
Yeah, he is a double-double machine. I was just looking up real quick where he ranked in terms of last season. Overall, it was around. I mean, he was like inside the top 20. So this is a guy that, for the range that you're getting him at, absolutely, what he delivers. He's going to give you a steady amount of points. He's going to give you a ton of rebounds, and he had some monster games last year, from what I can remember. So definitely a guy. You talk about a depth piece that can help you out. How about Zach Collins of the San Antonio Spurs going at consensus 132? A more valuable player than I think some give him credit for in terms of field goal percentage, occasional three, he can rebound, averaged 11 and 6 last year. And I'm kind of looking at this in the attention that Wemby is going to get in the paint. Zach Collins is going to be left alone. So this is a team that's going to be in a lot of high-scoring games. I think he could get his. So he's a depth piece that I'm looking to add, and he's almost free.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I know Barutha is a big Zach Collins guy. I feel like he's taken him in every draft that I've been in with him. And I do think Wembanyama helps him a ton. I think the attention that he's going to command on both ends is going to help Zach Collins kind of settle into more of a super role player role, which is probably good for him. I mean, you do forget he was a lottery pick. And I think expectations have kind of changed with him since, all the injuries that he dealt with in Portland and, kind of felt like his career was almost on the brink for a couple of years there. But bounced back with 63 games played last season. If you just isolate the 20 games in which he played more than 25 minutes, he averaged 16 and 8 with 4 assists, a steal, and a block per game, 53% from the field. He's kind of a borderline plus at the free throw line, hovering right around 80%. I mean, for a center, you'll take that every day of the week. So I like that call quite a bit. And with San Antonio, we're certainly going to worry about the direction of this team, especially over the second half. But I don't really think Zach Collins is in danger of like being shut down or being limited. Obviously they want to get looks at Wembanyama and Jeremy Sohan, but beyond that, it's like I don't think you're holding Zach Collins out. So Sandro Mamukelashvili and Charles Bassey can get more tick.
That was a phenomenal pronunciation on your part, by the way.
He's an ex-Buck. He's an ex-Buck, so I had to know that.
I got another one that I always
Okay.
this guy's, I think he might be on every roster that I've drafted, and that's Jaden Ivey going around pick 111. I love his explosiveness. I just loved what I saw from him in college, and I think enough of that translated in year one in his NBA career. Not afraid to shoot it from deep, so there's a good chance that he finishes. I would say finishing number 2 in scoring for the Pistons is virtually a lock for Jaden Ivey. So give me all the Ivy I can handle.
I go back and forth on Ivy, and I do think they're going to bring him off the bench. And much like Buddy Hield, I'm not sure it matters. I think he'll play enough minutes that starting versus coming off the bench is kind of a wash. And there's a case to be made that you kind of want him maybe operating as the number 1 option with the bench unit, as opposed to a distant number 2 behind Cade Cunningham, who's going to have the ball in his hands a ton. This Detroit roster, by the way, is just bizarre, right? I mean, the mix of like high upside young players that we like, Cunningham, Ivy, Asar Thompson, and then like, why is Alec Burks on this roster? Why is Bojan Bogdanovic still on this team? Joe Harris, Monte Morris, like they just have all these random veterans that I just wonder, are they going to force them into the lineup? Are they going to try to trick themselves into thinking that they're further along than they are? My hope is that they offload some of those guys, and then the front court is obviously just loaded with guys that I don't really love for fantasy this year, other than Jalen Duren. I will say on Ivy, like I avoided him everywhere last year. I thought he'd be more of a hindrance than he was in roto leagues, especially. And as the season went along, I think that the percentages especially started to fall off. Like he was 41% from the field, was not a good free throw shooter in college. That carried over. He was about 75% last season. So that's what I'm looking for him to improve, right? It's like, can he be a 44% shooter? Can he be a 78% shooter at the line? Because I do think the counting stats are going to be there. Like in a points league, I have no problem taking Jaden Ivey and expecting him to give me 16, 4, and 5, even if that means he's coming off the bench.
Yeah, he's an exciting player. He's going to get his opportunities. So this is a team that still needs to figure out who their foundational pieces are. Chances are Jaden Ivey is one of them.
Can I sell you on Collin Sexton? That's somebody I've been taking, with one of my final picks in a lot of leagues. Composite ADP of 127. You'll see him go higher in certain formats. You'll see him go lower in other formats. It's just kind of based on taste and preferences in a lot of ways. I was kind of in on him last year as well. Going to Utah, I'm like, all right, this could be a spot for him to rehab his value. This is a team that I think we're still not quite sure what the short-term direction is. I think they have some nice pieces in place, but they're still not really close to contending for a title or anything like that. I do still think, though, you look back, like Collin Sexton had back-to-back 20-plus point per game seasons in Cleveland. Didn't give you a whole lot else other than that, but kind of medium volume on 3-pointers, 3-4 assists per game, 1 steal per game, good free throw shooter. You'll take that. But I do think there's more upside with Sexton than most of the players that you're going to be looking at in the 130s or 140s.
It's another team that's going to score a lot of points. So that leads me to, I end up with a lot of Jazz players on my roster. For some reason or another, Collin Sexton has not been one of them. Okay. But you did it. You did a decent job in terms of selling me on his potential. Was able to score 16 points, 6 assists in their last preseason game against a real NBA team. So, I mean, this is a guy that is going to be a factor in a team on a team that is going to be in a ton of high scoring games. The Jazz had a lot of fantasy producers last year. I'm just not a total buyer in terms of the talent, and his lack of outside shooting really bothers me.
That's fair. And I do worry about where he fits in. Like, he's still young, but he's not maybe young enough for the Jazz, who I think want to get looks at, like Keontae George, who's looked good in the preseason. Talen Horton-Tucker, I think, is still in the mix for the starting shooting guard spot. So they have other guys in that backcourt that I think they may prioritize their development over Collin Sexton, getting his 18 points per game. So that's the main concern for me. Any other late round guys you want to hit on quick?
Yeah, there's one more that is more of an affinity play for me, because Saddiq Bey of the Hawks was on my daily fantasy rosters during some of my most profitable days. So he's like my lucky penny. I gotta have Saddiq Bey on my roster. A lot of mouths to feed in that Hawks offense, but he still got his last year after his trade from Detroit, 12 points per game in Atlanta, shot 52%. He's good for a steal per game. And if DeJounte Murray or DeAndre Hunter ever have to miss time, it is to the moon for my lucky penny, Saddiq Bey.
That's funny you say that, because I feel like I've had the complete opposite experience with him in DFS and in season long. It's like I'm just always rostering him at the wrong time. But I get it. I mean, I think he probably starts at the 4 for this team, right? I'm it's kind of Bey, Jalen Johnson, Hunter, and Griffin are all somewhat interchangeable on the wing. But I think he'll be the guy. And I think that was part of the reason that they were comfortable, sending John Collins to Utah and not really getting any major like win now piece back. I think they were just kind of content dropping him and saying, all right, more minutes for Saddiq Bey. So I think that's a good call there. For fantasy, you're chasing the points and you're chasing the threes. That's about it with him. And he takes so many threes that it harms his field goal percentage. Like he's not a bad shooter, but when I'm trying to look at his total, I mean, over half of his attempts in his career have been threes. And even though he's like a 36-37% shooter, that's just going to drag down your percentages by default. He's also been close to 1 steal per game over the last couple of years. So if he goes from playing 22, 23 minutes to 28, 29 minutes most nights, then I think it's conceivable that he could push over 1 steal. Yeah,
we just need Quinn Snyder to convince him to shoot some more twos, and then we'll be in the money. You're getting him right now 139.
Yeah.
Last pick, Saddiq Bey.
The last pick for me in a couple drafts has been Herb Jones. There's a bit of a glut on the wing for New Orleans. That's been the case for the last couple of years, but it's also had a way of just working itself out, partially because Zion, who you have penciled in for like 35 minutes a night, just doesn't play. So that's kind of my hedge for, if things go awry with Zion and, for the most part, I'm letting somebody else take that chance. I think Herb Jones is just there as the steady guy who could fill in. He could play shooting guard. He could play on the wing. He could defend up a position if he needs to. Trey Murphy's another guy that I like, but he's coming off of a knee injury, tore his meniscus over the summer. I don't think he's going to be ready to go until probably mid to late November. And if he hits the ground running and picks up where he left off, I think he's somebody with higher upside. But Herb Jones to me is kind of the ultimate safety valve on this Pelicans roster. And 2 years into the league, 1.7 steals, 1.6 steals per game. He's been a decent 3-point shooter as well. I mean, not nearly the same volume as Trey Murphy, but when you talk about late in the draft, kind of checking in on your different categories, it's like, all right, where do I need a little help here? If I'm light on steals, I'm always grabbing Herb Jones late.
Yeah, and he's almost like a handcuff, like you said, for Zion, because his value would shoot up if Zion has to miss time, which is going to happen at some point. It's just a matter of hopefully it's not too much time, especially for those that have Zion or for NBA fans in general. But Herb Jones is probably the most active player on the floor that I saw for New Orleans last night. Everybody else kind of picks their spots, and Brandon Ingram is their focal point offensively, but Herb Jones is kind of flying around the court. So guys like that are always gonna be an important factor of any NBA team.
Yeah, he has been starting in the preseason, and again, we'll see. When Trey Murphy's back, that could be his spot on the wing. But I do think Herb Jones probably opens the season as their starting 3. Any other players you want to hit on before we get out?
I think I'm good.
All right, man. Well, we're over an hour here, so we'll be on our way out. Always enjoy doing this episode with you, Brandon. Again, we'll be doing it every Wednesday from now through the end of the NBA season, and frankly, we'll probably do it in the playoffs too. There'll be enough to talk about there. We'll have some more betting content that we'll mix in throughout the year as well. Talk a little bit of DFS every now and then as the season gets underway. But we thank everybody for listening live here on Twitter or on YouTube. Please like, subscribe to the burgeoning RotoWire Fantasy Basketball YouTube channel. We just launched that a couple of weeks ago. It's been great so far, but want to keep building that. So we implore everybody to check us out there. You can find all of our episodes, all of our videos archived on that YouTube channel. And of course, you can find the audio version of this pod on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, wherever you get those pods. Brandon, looking forward to talking to you on SiriusXM later tonight, and enjoy the rest of your week.
Yes, indeed. Go get some buckets, ladies and gentlemen.